dwell in a house among his people. But now he has a home that's better than the first. It doesn't look like a building with a steeple. Now he's living in the people of the church. Brick after brick, God is building his temple. Brick after brick, he's making it strong. With Christ the sure foundation and his people as the stones, he is building a place he can live. Brick after brick.
Did you feel that? Something just happened that many of us take for granted. Another year is officially in the past. A chapter is closed. And now we look ahead to a new year. The mistakes, missteps, and missed opportunities of the past give way to hope, excitement, and joy for the new life God gives us, pursuing Christ with each new dawn. Through His grace, we get the chance to reset the clock, to forget what lies behind and strain forward to what lies ahead. As we work, play, rest, and worship, we know His mercies are new every morning. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength, arriving at next year's end through His faithfulness. So whatever we do this year, let's give it to God, seeking His will, trusting His plan, and taking this opportunity to restart.
As I was seeking the Lord this week for a fitting message for our church, He led me to the book of Leviticus. Now, there are not a lot of sermons that come out of Leviticus, but if I could turn your attention to Leviticus 1, and I'm reading from the New International Version, verse 7. The sons of Aaron, the priests, are to put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. In Leviticus 6, from verse 8, the Lord said to Moses, "Give Aaron and his sons this command. These are the regulations for the burnt offering. The burnt offering is to remain on the altar hearth throughout the night till morning, and the fire must be kept burning on the altar." Down in verse 12, the fire on the altar must be kept burning. It must not go out. Every morning the priest is to add firewood and arrange the burnt offering on the fire and burn the fat of the fellowship offerings on it. The fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously. It must not go out. I want to speak this morning on the subject, let's keep this fire burning. Let's keep this fire burning. Moses, when given the law to Israel, came with an array of instructions and regulations regarding offerings and sacrifices. These were given predominantly to the priests, who were responsible for managing the many offerings and sacrifices that would occur. While people were invited and encouraged to do their own offerings, the priests, Levites, would be the lead in performing, teaching the many offerings that they had. There were several offerings that Israel was commanded to keep, and they were somewhat complicated. You could do an entire course on the specifics of the various offerings. Just to name a few, there was the sin offering. And the sin offering is not to be thought of as we may think of salvation or the redemption of our sinful souls. The sin offering was for unintentional sins. And someone would realize that they had done something wrong, not on purpose, but realize that they fell short of a particular law, then that was to be remedied with the sin offering. There was purification offerings. These had to do with the completion of certain vows, such as the vow of the Nazarite. It was given to women whose firstborn may be of a male child. And we see that in the New Testament with Mary and Joseph going to the temple with 2 turtle doves to satisfy the purification offering that was required of Mary. There was the guilt or the trespass offering. This was an offering that was performed for theft or fraud, particularly against the temple or the temple items, when someone cheated in their obligations, their payments, that would be remedied with the guilt or trespass offering. There was also the food and drink offering, sometimes called a grain offering or meat offerings. The food or drink offering was often used to accompany other various offerings, where they would pour out wine along the altars, creating an aroma. Paul uses this analogy as he sat on death row before his execution. He says, I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. Then there is the peace offering, or the free will offering, sometimes called the fellowship offering. This was an offering that anyone could do at any time for any reason, and the purpose of that was to express one's gratitude, thanksgiving, and worship toward God. These were just some of the offerings that were there, not to count the special offerings and instructions that went with them on such occasions as the Day of Atonement, the Passover. And then there is the burnt offering, which is what our text is speaking of. The burnt offering was the most common of all offerings. It was also the oldest of all of the offerings and sacrifices. Without a doubt, it appears to be the type of offering that Abel presented in Genesis. The first time the phrase burnt offering is used was in Noah's case. When Noah makes landfall, then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. A burnt offering was what was asked of Abraham and Isaac. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. It's interesting that the Septuagint Bible is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It is the Bible believed to be read by Jesus and the apostles. And in the Septuagint Bible, that verse that uses says to give Isaac as a burnt offering. In the Greek, the word for burnt offerings, interestingly, is holocaust. So the burnt offerings were oldest and most common of all the offerings. Job, who was not a Hebrew and was there long before the law of Moses was given, perhaps even before Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, when a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them, his children, to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them. So we see, once again, the burnt offering as being the most oldest and common of all of the sacrifices. Now, when we think of the purpose of sacrificing to the Lord, the idea that a sacrifice was used for atonement, while that is very true, it's also a very narrow understanding of the sacrifices. Yes, they were a means of atonement. Atonement means to make at one with God. When you're seeking the forgiveness and the redemption from God, sacrifices such as burnt offerings were used. They were also used as a substitution. When burnt offerings were presented, the priest would literally lay his hands on the animal, signifying the transferring of his sin and guilt over and onto the beast. But another reason for offerings and sacrifices went beyond just the seeking of forgiveness and redemption. It was a means of communion. It was a means of connecting with God. The offerings and sacrifices was the point of contact between a supernatural God and his creation. It was the coming together of God and his people in a union, in a time of fellowship. When Solomon erected the temple, in the dedication of that temple, we read, when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The fire represented the presence, the glory of God. God is making contact. God is revealing his power. It's in this very dedication that familiar verse comes out. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Here we are in a new year. And with all new years comes a time of reflection. It's when we look back over the past year, make evaluations, look forward to the oncoming year, and anticipate what that might bring. And I understand over the years that may vary from various people, from people to people. There was just one occasion that I could think of when the reflections of the past year was somewhat universal. And of course, that being the year 2020. And I don't know anybody that had a good time in that year. For the most part, God has blessed this church tremendously over the past year. We have much to be thankful for. But I am not naive enough to understand that that may not apply to every individual in our church. And also, I think about those who hear us, worship with us over the internet, those who may hear this message while we rejoice of God's many blessings. I understand that for some who may be listening, it wasn't a great year. For some, it was a blessed year, time of family, get-togethers. But for others, it may have been a time of estrangement in families, breakdowns of families, painful breakdowns in families. For some, it may be a time of marriages, new unions and families were formed, new relationships were birthed. Or it was a time of finalizing a failed marriage or the termination of a relationship. It may be the year you got saved, got baptized. For others, maybe the year you fell away and have broken relationship with God, where you've lost ground. For some, good news, things to rejoice over. For others, bad news, and the start of a downward trend. Some may have landed that great job that afforded them financial advantages. And for others, it might have been the year you got laid off, lost your job, or your business failed. It may have been the year you received that bad news. It may have been the year you had to say goodbye to loved ones. So a new year may be many things to different people. But for all who love the Lord and serve Him, whatever circumstance last year may have brought you, good or bad, we can know that in all that, whether you realized it or felt it or not, that God never left you. Jeremiah was a prophet who experienced many bad things. And in a time when he was persecuted for trying to do what God called him to do, at a down point in his life, he spoke as we may feel from time to time. Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in my heart, like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I could not. There are things that would threaten or cause you to diminish the fire of God in your life, as it was with Jeremiah. But the fire that was in him kept him going. God has done things in your past in order to make your present more powerful. It can be tempting to neglect the God in our lives that will cause us to let our fire go out. Reminded of a story in the New Testament. It's a familiar story of the two disciples that were walking back home after the crucifixion. It's a post-resurrection appearance, so we mostly refer to it around Easter time. But the two disciples have had enough, and they thought all that life had to offer was gone. And as they're walking home, dismayed, Jesus appears to them on their road. We read the story in Luke 24, and I'm going to pick out some highlight verses to give us a gist of what's going on. Verse 13, now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. Verse 20, the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. Verse 25, he said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Verse 31, then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" In this story, we see a transformation of two depressed disciples. When Jesus gets there, they're standing with their faces downcast. By the end of the story, they're saying, "Were not our hearts burning within us?" Well, what happened between that verse and this verse? What made the difference? They knew about Jesus. They no doubt could recall his teachings. They no doubt could recall the parables that he spoke. They could tell you of the miracles they witnessed. That's not what made the difference. What made the difference was the presence of Jesus Christ. When the presence of God comes in your life, that's what starts a fire. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. The promise of his presence is what will keep this fire burning. Moses, who valued the presence of God so much, Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here." If you were to spill over a cup of water, it may make a mess, but the water doesn't multiply. If you spill a cup of water, it doesn't automatically turn into a flood. But if you strike a match, and you take a match and strike it at the right time and the right place, you will get a fire that will spread out. If we take the fire of God and burn it in our lives, when people come into this church, you won't have to ask them to clap their hands. If we let the fire burn here in this church, when people come in, you won't have to ask them to raise their hands and sing along. When the fire of God comes in your life, it will take you through no matter what comes your way. Oh, hallelujah. I don't know about you. I don't know what this year is going to bring me. But one thing I am determined to keep my fire burning, because I've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord, trusting in his every word, and he never failed me yet. So I'm going to let the fire burn. I'll let the fire burn in my soul. I'll let the fire burn in my heart. I'll let the fire burn in my mind. When I'm down and out and I feel like giving up, Lord, set me on fire and keep this fire going. Hallelujah. If the fire burns here in this church, if you let the fire burn, healing will come your way. If you let the fire burn, your marriage can be restored. If you let the fire burn, people will come to know the Lord. I'm going to let it burn. Let this fire burn. Let this fire burn. Let this fire burn.
Brick after brick, God is building his temple. Brick after brick, he is making it strong. With Christ the sure foundation and his people as the stones, he is building a place he can